When Elon Musk posed the question, "Does God exist?" that had baffled humanity for generations, the audience fell silent. Elon asked, "Silent, how many of you believe in God right now?" It was a straightforward question, but it held a weight that caused everyone in the room to pause and consider. Some raised their hands, while others did not, but many just stared at him, waiting for him to say something else. The question hung in the air thick with tension as Elon paused. He wasn't just here to answer questions, he was here to challenge the very foundations of what people thought. His normally innovative and excited face now displayed a rare seriousness, and the audience, which included many scientists and tech moguls. Philosophers were aware that this evening would not be a conventional discourse on faith and science, he added. Two distinct forces that have molded the planet. The subject of whether it is possible for the two to cohabit has been discussed extensively in the past, but never with the ferocity that Elon Musk brought to it. Some people argue that they cannot coexist, while others insist that they must. Stepping back from the podium, he continued, "Let me take you on a journey into the unknown." His words broke through the cacophony of the audience demanding attention, and he then started telling a narrative that would alter everything. It was many years ago when Elon first started doubting everything as a young child. In the early years of his career, he had been growing up in a household that valued science, facts, and evidence. His father had always told him that if something couldn't be proven to exist, it didn't. He had never given much thought to the idea of God. Instead, he had always focused on the laws of nature and the science governing the universe. However, in his late 20s, his perspective started to change. It wasn't a single incident, but rather a string of little incidents, each one adding weight to the question that was starting to form in his mind: what if there was more? The city lights flashed below him as he stood on his apartment's rooftop, gazing up at the stars. However, when he looked out at the infinite expanse of space, the stars overhead seemed so far away, so huge, so mysterious. Something within of him stirred, and it wasn't just the beauty of the sky, it was the overwhelming sensation of something larger. When the chilly night air brushed over Elon's skin, he felt the first germ of something greater than himself. Was this all a random accident of physics, or was there a deeper force at work that science alone could not explain? He probably didn't tell anyone about this feeling because it was simply too enormous and unnerving, but he carried on with his task. Constructing firms, launching rockets, and transforming the world, yet the question remained in the back of his mind like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. The tension in the room increased as Elon started to delve deeper into his thoughts on faith and science. He talked about the divide he had always seen in the world. As he stood on stage that night, ready to address the audience about God and science, he realized that this wasn't just a question of belief but also a question of purpose, one that demanded an answer even if he didn't have all the answers himself. People who blindly adhered to religion and those who only used science to provide an explanation. Anything, but what if they were both incorrect? He said, "It's easy to say that science has all the answers, but the more I've learned, the more I've realized that science itself can't explain everything." He paused to allow his words to sink in. For instance, we know how the universe began with the Big Bang, but what caused it? What existed before that? What was the force that triggered the beginning of everything we know in the room? How can we dismiss God as something that doesn't fit into our modern understanding? Was quiet, people were bending forward to listen, and you can't use a microscope to show that God exists. A telescope, you can't measure faith in terms of data, he added, but that doesn't mean God doesn't exist, it just means that we don't have the tools to fully understand it. Elon's voice grew softer, but the point was clear. Even though we live in a world where everything is quantified, measured, and analyzed, there are still mysteries that cannot be explained, and perhaps those mysteries point to something greater than ourselves. The audience was enthralled. They weren't merely listening to a speech, they were feeling the weight of Elon's remarks, recognizing the internal struggle. The more Elon talked, the more the audience was engrossed in. In his message, he wasn't just talking about God, he was also talking about the human condition and Elon's desire to understand the universe in order to find meaning. The turning point occurred when he spoke with a brilliant scientist who had once told him that science is the search for truth, but that some truths cannot be found in a lab. This statement had baffled him at the time, but as he stood on that stage, he realized that there were truths that couldn't be quantified or measured. Elon's thoughts flashed back to. He had experienced innumerable setbacks since launching SpaceX, but each time he persisted, he felt. He was motivated to continue the task because he felt that there was something bigger than himself. He asserted that faith is what keeps us going when we don't know all the answers. It is what enables us to go past seemingly insurmountable challenges. It is what sustains us when reason and science are unable to explain why. His remarks were so revolutionary. The audience, who had before heard about advancements in technology, was now hearing about something much more significant. Elon had always been a logical and scientific man, but tonight he was displaying the world that even he, with all his accomplishments and knowledge, was looking for something more. As he talked about his journey, Elon told the audience about his own quest for meaning. He had traveled to the furthest reaches of space, developed technologies that pushed the limits of human possibility, and faced unthinkable obstacles, but something was always lacking. He asked, "What is the purpose of all this? Is it just about developing faster rockets, electric cars, and technology, or is there something deeper, something more meaningful, something that we are all aiming for?" Struck a chord with viewers for the first time, they had also asked themselves the same question. They came to understand that there was more to the solution than just science or faith. Elon stopped to gaze at the crowd's sea of faces. Elon Musk had always been the brilliant inventor and visionary entrepreneur, but tonight he was revealing a side of himself that few had seen, a side that was looking for meaning and purpose. "I don't have the answers, but I think that the pursuit of truth, whether it be through science, faith, or both, is what defines us as humans." The audience sat in stunned silence. For connection, and they all realized at that same time that the query of whether. As the evening wore on, Elon's speech continued to unfold layer by layer. He didn't have a clear answer and wasn't pretending to, but his honesty, vulnerability, and willingness to question everything struck a deep chord with the audience. He talked about how, as a child, he had always been taught to rely on reason and logic, but as he grew older, he started to realize that there were things in this world that didn't fit neatly into the confines of reason, love, hope, and faith. They were as real as anything in the actual world, yet they couldn't be quantified or measured. The room was silent as Elon spoke, and his words were straightforward but profound. The universe is vast and we are just tiny specks in it, but that doesn't mean our lives are meaningless. Every choice we make and every action we take is a reflection of who we are and what we believe. He paused to give his words time to sink in, and perhaps he said slowly, just perhaps that belief is what connects us all, whether it's faith in God, science, or the goodness of people. The sound of individuals inhaling deeply as they considered the magnitude of what they had just. When Elon finished speaking, the audience sat in stunned silence. There was no grand response or conclusive statement, but there was also a feeling of connection and unity, that despite their disparate backgrounds and beliefs, they were all engaged in the same quest for the truth. Elon exited the stage with his thoughts still racing with the questions that had always plagued him. He wasn't sure if God existed, but he knew that finding the answer was one of the most significant journeys of all, and as the crowd gradually started to thin out as the lights came on, one thing was evident. The conundrum of faith and science wasn't just Elon Musk's, it was humanity's, and perhaps that's the greatest discovery of all. As he left the platform, his footsteps reverberated throughout the now quiet auditorium. There had been no grand announcement or final proclamation, but for a brief while, the weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The discourse he had started lingered in the air like a ripple on the surface of still water, leaving people with more questions than answers. Elon stopped at the stage's edge and looked around the crowd. The expressions that stared back at him were a mixture of wonder, perplexity, and interest. Some of them were lost in meditation. Others appeared inspired as if they had just heard something that completely changed their perspective. but most of all, there was a noticeable silence that came from introspection rather than disappointment. Their expressions revealed the internal conflict between faith and reason. "What happens now?" they seemed to be asking. Elon turned and started to down the stairs, his mind racing with the weight of the question he had left them with: does God exist? This was a well-worn topic that had plagued theorists, philosophers, and scientists for generations, but today it felt distinctive. There was something about the way he phrased the query, something about the point where. As Elon moved toward the back of the room, a few people approached him, including an elderly guy, who encouraged people to think more deeply than the surface of their daily lives through the use of science and faith. The elderly man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've asked myself 1,000 questions." His face was lined with age and wisdom, and he had the appearance of someone who had experienced many stages of life, but his eyes sparkled with the same curiosity as a child. "I've been looking for that answer my entire life. Periods. Is there something more important out there than what we can see and touch?" "Thank you." Elon nodded and gave a small, understanding smile, reminding me that the search is just as important as the answer. He didn't have to say anything because the man understood that they were both seekers in a vast universe and that their shared journey was what really mattered. As Elon continued to move through the crowd, more people approached him, each with their own struggles and stories. A young woman with teary eyes then came up to him. She held a tiny cross around her neck and murmured in a tremulous voice, "I've always had faith." She said, "Mr. Musk," with her hands trembling a little, but it can be challenging at times. "The world is so big and full of stuff that I don't know how to make sense of it. Everybody, how do you continue looking when the answers are unclear?" Elon's frown softened as he stared at her. "I believe the important thing," he started, "was to accept the unknown, religion and science, since they are not mutually exclusive but rather two sides of the same coin. Science asks how the universe functions. Faith queries why we should keep looking even while the answers don't always match up." The young woman nodded while dabbing at her tears, indicating that it's acceptable to not have all the answers. Elon grinned and said, "It's okay, it's human." She briefly glanced down. As Elon proceeded through the crowd, she thought about what he had said and then smiled back, feeling a wave of calm come over her. He heard snippets of conversations with people discussing, questioning, and sharing their own opinions. Some talked about faith, others about science, and many wondered how the two could coexist. However, there was a calm harmony and an understanding that it was acceptable to not have everything figured out. It was at that moment that Elon realized something profound. It wasn't his speech that had struck a chord with the audience, but rather the question itself that he hadn't given the solutions because he didn't have them, and in a society where everyone is fixated on finding answers. As he left the building, Elon paused for a moment, gazing up at the cosmos. The universe was so vast, so unfathomably big, and here he was, just one man standing on a small planet, searching for answers that might never come yet. Rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt connected. There was something profoundly comforting about being part of this grand mystery, even though he wasn't sure if God existed. Sometimes the best gift you can give is permission to wonder outside existence. He was uncertain whether a higher power was directing the cosmos, but he was certain that the search for. As he gazed up at the stars, his mind drifted to the future. Would humanity discover evidence of a divine creator in the ensuing years, or would the answers lie in the very fabric of the universe itself? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: this journey, this never-ending search for truth, was what motivated him and so many others behind him. Knowledge, whether through faith or science, was what gave life meaning. One of the scientists who had attended the conference emerged as the door opened, wearing a lab coat. And concern was written all over his face. "Admittedly," the man said, "getting close to Elon, you've given us all something to think about, even if I wasn't sure what to anticipate from your discussion tonight. I've always believed in science, but now I question whether there is room for both." Elon only said, "There must be." As the man left, Elon stood by himself once more, gazing up at the stars and taking a deep breath, feeling the cool night air on his skin. The question of God's existence would remain unanswered for the time being, but the search and the journey were where the true magic occurred in the distance. The man nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you for that." Elon sensed that the city's lights were twinkling on the ground like stars. He feels calm. He didn't need to know everything tonight since the journey itself was the solution, and as he made his way to his car, a small smile pulled at the corners of his lips. He was a part of something greater than himself, the never-ending quest for the truth, and perhaps that was plenty. Elon Musk drove silently home. The car's hum blended into the backdrop of his thoughts, replaying the events of the evening, his speech, the audience's response, and the discussions that ensued. It was one of those times that stuck with him. As he made his way through the city streets, not because of its grandeur but rather because of its profound simplicity. Every human being had at some point pondered the same questions as he did. Does God exist? What is the purpose of all this? These weren't questions that only scientists or theologians asked, rather, they were questions that every human being had at some point whispered into the vastness of the universe hoping for a sign, a nudge, or an answer. As Elon pulled into his driveway, the house stood silent. He saw how the world seemed to be at peace, the street lights flickered, casting gentle glows on the buildings. And dark, but for one light that shone in the living room, he exited the car with the door closed. The door gently and stood for a moment beneath the night sky, which seemed to twinkle a bit brighter above him as if the stars were also taking part in this eternal conversation. He had always felt a strong connection to the stars, maybe because of his work with SpaceX, but it went beyond that. Looking up at the night sky reminded him of how insignificant he was in the scheme of things, but also how important his journey could be. Elon entered the house to the gentle ticking of a clock. And the electrical hum in the distance. The calm inside stood in stark contrast to the vigor of the. He sat down on the couch and slowly exhaled as his phone buzzed with emails, notifications, and reminders of the innumerable tasks that awaited him, but tonight they could wait. He closed his eyes and leaned back, still struggling with the question, does God exist? He had always relied on science to provide him with the means to create, explore, and construct it, and it had taken him to the edge of space and beyond, but this ancient question, could science ever really answer it? Elon Musk drove silently home. The car's hum disappearing into the context of his ideas. His thoughts replayed the events of the evening, his speech, the response of the audience, and the discussions that ensued as he made his way through the city streets. He observed how everyone seemed to be at peace and how the street lights flickered, casting gentle glows on the buildings. People were busy with their daily lives, some rushing home and others wandering aimlessly, lost in thought. It was one of those moments that lingered not because of its grandeur but because of its profound simplicity. Elon couldn't help but wonder if God existed and why all of this was happening, and how many of them were struggling with the same issues as him. These were questions that all people had, not just those who were theologians or scientists. Had at some point whispered into the vastness of the universe in hopes of receiving a sign, a nudge, or an answer. As Elon pulled into his driveway, the house was silent and dark with the exception of a single light shining in the living room. He got out of the car, gently closed the door, and stood for a moment beneath the night sky, where the stars appeared to be taking part in this eternal conversation. He had always felt a strong connection to the stars, possibly as a result of his work with SpaceX, but there was something more. There was something timeless and eternal about gazing up at the night sky. It served as a reminder of his tiny place in the vast scheme of items, but how important his trip could be once he enters the house. The faint hum of electricity and the gentle ticking of a clock welcomed Elon. He sat down on the couch and slowly exhaled. His phone buzzed with notifications, emails, and messages reminding him of the innumerable responsibilities that awaited him, but tonight they could wait. He leaned back and closed his eyes, his mind still struggling with the question of whether God exists, which he had always relied on. Science had provided him with the means to develop, investigate, and construct the answers, and it had led him to the edge of space and Could science ever provide a true answer to this age-old question? His mind drifted back to his early years, recalling times when he had sat with his family and heard tales of the universe's creation and mysteries that no one could explain. He recalled the wonder he had felt as a child gazing up at the night sky, not with a scientific mind but with a heart full of wonder. At that time, the universe seemed like a vast magical place full of possibilities and the unknown.